The room went silent before I even realized why. That is the moment I remember most clearly when I think back to my baby shower. Not the decorations. Not the gifts. Not the cake. Not the games my friends had spent weeks organizing. What I remember is the silence. The kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone suddenly understands that something has gone terribly wrong. At the time, I was 31 years old and 7 months pregnant with my first child. Ryan and I had been married for 4 years, and this baby was something we had hoped and prayed for during a long and emotional journey. Every ultrasound photo sat carefully displayed on our refrigerator. Every tiny pair of baby socks felt like a miracle. I was excited, nervous, grateful. Like most first-time mothers, I spent countless hours imagining the future. I pictured holding my baby for the first time. I pictured sleepless nights and first birthdays and school concerts. I pictured becoming a mother. What I did not picture was my mother-in-law trying to become one too. The baby shower took place on a warm Saturday afternoon in early spring. My sister had rented a private event room at a country club outside town. Everything looked beautiful. Soft pastel decorations filled the room. A long table displayed gifts wrapped in colorful paper. Friends and relatives laughed as they moved between tables carrying lemonade and slices of cake. For most of the afternoon, I felt genuinely happy. Patricia arrived about 30 minutes after the event started. She walked into the room carrying several expensive gift bags and immediately became the center of attention. That was not unusual. Patricia had always possessed a strong personality. People naturally paid attention when she entered a room. She hugged Ryan. She hugged me. She greeted relatives and friends. Everything seemed completely normal. Looking back now, I wish I had paid closer attention to some of the things she said that day. Small comments that seemed harmless at the time. Comments that would later make much more sense. Throughout the afternoon, Patricia repeatedly referred to the baby as our baby. First, I assumed she meant the family. Collectively. Plenty of grandparents speak that way. Nobody seemed concerned. Neither was I. Then she began talking about future plans. I cannot wait until the baby spends weekends with me, she said to one group of guests. Later she told someone else, I already know exactly how I am going to raise this little one. People laughed politely. I laughed too. Felt easier than questioning her. Besides, everyone knew she was excited about becoming a grandmother. At least that was what I told myself. As the afternoon continued, guests gathered around while I opened presents. Ryan sat beside me helping organize gift bags and thank you cards. The atmosphere felt warm and joyful. Every gift carried a story. Every package represented love and support from people who cared about our growing family. Then Patricia stood up holding a glass of sparkling cider. I would like to make a toast, she announced. Everyone smiled and turned toward her. I remember feeling touched. Despite our occasional differences, I assumed she wanted to say something kind about becoming a grandmother. Patricia cleared her throat and smiled proudly. I am so excited for this baby, she began. Several guests nodded. In fact, I have been waiting for this moment for years. More smiles. More nods. Then her next sentence changed everything. And I cannot wait to finally raise a baby again. A few people laughed uncertainly. I felt my stomach tighten. Patricia continued speaking. Sarah and Ryan are going to be busy, of course. Young parents always are. But do not worry. She smiled broadly. I will make sure this baby is raised properly. The room became noticeably quieter. I glanced toward Ryan. He looked confused. Patricia either did not notice or chose not to. Honestly, she said with a laugh, I will probably end up raising this child myself. Nobody laughed this time. Not really. A few uncomfortable chuckles appeared around the room before quickly fading away. I stared at her, waiting for some sign that she was joking. Some wink. Some smile. Some indication that she understood how strange her words sounded. Instead, she looked completely serious. Around the room, guests exchanged uncertain glances. My sister froze beside the gift table. One of my friends lowered her eyes. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Meanwhile, Patricia stood there smiling proudly, as though she had just delivered the perfect toast. In that moment, surrounded by decorations celebrating my future as a mother, I experienced a feeling I could not quite explain. It was not anger. Not yet. It was something closer to disbelief. Because for the first time, I found myself wondering a question that would follow me long after the party ended. What if Patricia was not joking at all? The drive home from the baby shower felt much longer than the 30 minutes it normally took. Ryan kept one hand on the steering wheel, while the other rested lightly on the center console between us. The radio played softly in the background, but neither of us paid much attention to it. My mind remained fixed on Patricia's announcement. I replayed every word over and over again. The confidence in her voice. The way she smiled. The complete absence of hesitation. Most of all, I kept thinking about how serious she had sounded. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. That was awkward. I turned toward him. Awkward. He glanced at me briefly. Okay. More than awkward. I waited. Do you think she was joking? He sighed. I honestly do not know. That answer bothered me more than I expected. If Ryan could not tell whether his own mother was joking, then maybe I was not imagining how strange the whole thing had been. When we arrived home, I tried to focus on the positive parts of the day. I unpacked gifts, folded tiny baby clothes, read cards from friends and family. Yet Patricia's words lingered in the back of my mind. By the following morning, I had almost convinced myself to let it go. Then Patricia called. The conversation started normally enough. She asked how I was feeling. She asked whether I liked the gifts. Then the topic shifted. I have been thinking about sleeping arrangements, she said. I frowned. Sleeping arrangements? For when the baby arrives. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. What about them? Patricia sounded cheerful. Well, newborns are exhausting. I do not want you and Ryan becoming overwhelmed. Something about the way she phrased it immediately made me uncomfortable. We have been preparing for that. Of course you have, she said quickly. But I think it makes sense for the baby to spend a few nights each week at my house once things settle down. I stared at the wall in front of me. A few nights each week? Just so I can help. My stomach tightened. The baby was not even born yet. We had not discussed childcare. We had not discussed overnight visits. Yet Patricia was already talking as though those decisions had been made. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. Then something unexpected happened. Memories started resurfacing. Small moments I had ignored for months suddenly looked different. A few weeks earlier, Patricia had referred to the nursery as our nursery. At the time I laughed. During a family dinner, she told relatives that she would be teaching the baby everything important. Everyone treated it as grandmother excitement. I had to. Then there was the shopping trip. Patricia insisted on buying a crib for her guest room. When I asked why she needed a crib immediately, she simply smiled and said grandparents should always be prepared. None of those moments seemed alarming individually. Together they painted a different picture. That evening I shared my concerns with Ryan. He listened carefully while I explained everything. When I finished, he leaned back on the couch. I think Mom is just excited. The response frustrated me more than I wanted to admit. Ryan, excited grandparents do not announce that they are raising someone else's child. He rubbed his forehead. You are right. That part was weird. Weird. I repeated. She is already making plans that nobody asked her to make. He remained quiet. I could see him thinking. For the first time, uncertainty appeared on his face. Not agreement. Not yet. But uncertainty. Over the next week, Patricia continued calling regularly. Every conversation seemed to include assumptions about the baby. She talked about future schedules, future routines, future decisions. Sometimes she spoke as though she would simply step into a parenting role automatically. One afternoon she even referred to herself as the baby's second mother. She laughed after saying it, but the comment landed heavily. The more I listened, the more a troubling realization began to form. The baby shower announcement had not been a random joke. It had not been a single awkward moment. It was part of something larger. A pattern. A belief Patricia had quietly been building for months. And for the first time, I found myself asking a question that frightened me far more than anything she had said at the party. If Patricia genuinely believed she would help raise my child, how far was she willing to take that belief once the baby actually arrived? Over the next month, Patricia's involvement in the baby's future seemed to grow with every conversation. What made it difficult to address was that she never presented her ideas as suggestions. She spoke about them as though they were already established facts. The closer I got to my due date, the more frequently she inserted herself into decisions that Ryan and I had not even finished discussing. One Saturday afternoon, she invited us to lunch at her house. I expected a quiet meal and some conversation about the upcoming birth. Instead, I walked into what felt like a planning meeting for a project I did not remember approving. The dining room table was covered with notebooks, printed articles, and baby catalogs. Patricia greeted us enthusiastically. "Perfect timing," she said. "I have been organizing a few things." Ryan and I exchanged a glance before sitting down. Patricia opened one of the notebooks immediately. "I made a schedule." My stomach tightened. "A schedule?" She nodded proudly. "For the first 6 months." Ryan looked surprised. "What kind of schedule?" Patricia turned several pages and pointed to handwritten notes. "Feeding routines, sleeping routines, visit schedules, development milestones." I stared at the pages. Entire sections had already been filled in. She had planned holidays, weekend visits, future babysitting arrangements. There were notes about when the baby would stay overnight at her house. Notes about activities she wanted to introduce. Notes about traditions she intended to start. None of it had been discussed with us. "Patricia," I said carefully, "this is very detailed." She smiled. "That is because preparation matters." Then she tapped one section proudly. "I even included a rotation schedule, so the baby gets enough time with me each week." The way she said it sent a chill through me. It sounded less like a grandmother hoping to spend time with a grandchild and more like someone negotiating custody. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For the first time, I noticed concern crossing his face without me having to point it out. The lunch continued, but I struggled to focus. Every few minutes, Patricia introduced another plan, another assumption, another decision. She talked about what the baby would eat, which preschool program she preferred, which pediatrician she thought we should choose. At one point she even said, "Young parents usually need a lot of guidance." Then she looked directly at me. "Do not worry. I will make sure nothing important gets overlooked." The comment might have sounded harmless to someone else. To me, it felt like a vote of no confidence. As though motherhood were a position she expected me to hold temporarily until she stepped in. On the drive home, neither Ryan nor I spoke for several minutes. Finally, he broke the silence. "That was a lot." I looked at him. "Now do you see what I have been talking about?" He nodded slowly. "I think I am starting to." Hearing those words brought relief but not comfort. Because if Ryan could finally see it, then the situation was probably even more serious than I had realized. A few days later, another incident pushed my concerns even further. My friend Melissa invited me to coffee. We spent most of the afternoon talking about pregnancy and preparing for motherhood. At one point she hesitated before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Of course." Melissa looked uncomfortable. "Why does your mother-in-law keep telling people she is going to raise the baby?" My heart sank. "What do you mean?" Melissa stirred her coffee slowly. "She mentioned it at your shower." I thought it was a joke. Then I ran into her at the grocery store last week. I already knew where the conversation was heading. "What did she say?" Melissa sighed. "She told several people that she would probably end up doing most of the parenting, because grandparents have more experience." For a moment I could not speak. Hearing the same pattern repeated outside family gatherings changed everything. This was no longer limited to private conversations. Patricia was presenting this version of the future to other people as though it were inevitable. That evening, I sat alone in the nursery we had spent months preparing. Soft light from a nearby lamp illuminated the crib. Tiny blankets sat neatly folded on a shelf. The room represented every hope Ryan and I carried for our child. Yet instead of feeling excited, I felt unsettled. Because the more evidence I gathered, the harder it became to dismiss. Patricia was not simply excited about becoming a grandmother. Somewhere along the way, she had begun imagining a role that belonged to someone else. And unless something changed soon, that imagination was going to collide with reality. About 2 weeks before my due date, something happened that finally connected all the pieces. Until then, Patricia's behavior had been unsettling but easy for other people to explain away. She was excited. She was enthusiastic. She was preparing. Those explanations were becoming harder to accept, but they still existed. Then I visited her house one Tuesday afternoon, and everything changed. Patricia had invited me over to look through some old family photo albums. Ryan was working late, and I thought it might be a pleasant way to spend an hour. First, the visit felt completely normal. We sat at the kitchen table drinking tea, while she showed me photographs from Ryan's childhood. She pointed out school pictures, family vacations, and birthday parties. For a while, I almost convinced myself that maybe I had been overthinking everything. Then Patricia mentioned she wanted to show me something upstairs. "I finally finished it," she said excitedly. I followed her down the hallway and up a staircase. She led me toward a spare bedroom at the back of the house. When she opened the door, I stopped walking. The room looked like a fully prepared nursery. Not a corner for occasional visits. Not a simple guest setup. A nursery. A white crib stood against one wall. A changing table sat beneath a window. Shelves held diapers, blankets, toys, baby books, and stuffed animals. There was even a rocking chair positioned beside a small nightlight. For several seconds I could not speak. Patricia smiled proudly. "What do you think?" I slowly looked around the room. Every detail appeared carefully planned. Every item had been chosen intentionally. Nothing about it looked temporary. "You did all of this?" I finally asked. "Of course." She sounded delighted. "The baby will need a proper room here." My stomach tightened immediately. "A proper room?" Patricia nodded as though the answer were obvious. "The baby will be spending plenty of time with me." I tried to keep my voice calm. "Patricia, newborns usually stay with their parents." She laughed lightly. "At first, yes." Then she sat down in the rocking chair. "But once things settle down, you will appreciate the help." I looked around again. The nursery represented far more than preparation. It represented expectation. Not hope. Expectation. Patricia had not created a space in case the baby visited occasionally. She had created a space because she genuinely believed this arrangement would become a regular part of our lives. As I stood there, another realization hit me. This room had taken time to build. Time to paint. Time to decorate. Time to furnish. She had been planning this for months. Long before the baby shower. Long before her announcement. Long before I began noticing the pattern. Suddenly dozens of past conversations made sense. The references to our baby. The schedules. The assumptions. The plans she discussed as though they were already approved. None of it was spontaneous. Patricia had been quietly constructing a vision of the future that placed her at the center of my child's life. Later that evening, I told Ryan everything. At first he seemed surprised by the nursery itself. Then I showed him photographs I had taken with my phone. He scrolled through them slowly. The crib. The changing station. The shelves filled with supplies. The rocking chair. His expression became more serious with each image. "Wow," he said quietly. "Exactly," I replied. He sat silently for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "I do not think this is just excitement anymore." Hearing those words felt significant. For weeks I had been trying to explain what I felt. For weeks Ryan had searched for innocent explanations. Now he was seeing the same thing I saw. Not because I convinced him. Because the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. That night, after Ryan went to bed, I remained awake sitting in our nursery. I looked at the crib we had assembled together. I looked at the books waiting on the shelves. I looked at the tiny clothes folded neatly in drawers. For the first time, I stopped asking whether Patricia intended to help. The answer no longer mattered. Intentions were not the real issue. The issue was that somewhere along the way, Patricia had started imagining herself in a role that belonged to me. And if that belief remained unchallenged after the baby arrived, the conflict I had been quietly fearing might become impossible to avoid. The realization that kept me awake that night followed me into the next morning. For weeks, I had focused on Patricia's words, her comments, her assumptions, her plans. But sitting alone in the nursery after seeing the room she had built in her own house, I finally understood something important. The problem was not that Patricia wanted to help. The problem was that she had stopped seeing the difference between helping and controlling. Once that thought entered my mind, I started viewing every interaction through a different lens. Suddenly, patterns that once seemed confusing became remarkably clear. Patricia was not preparing to support new parents. She was preparing to direct them. The distinction mattered. A few days later, Ryan and I attended a routine appointment with my doctor. Everything looked healthy, and we left feeling relieved and excited. On the drive home, we began discussing what life might look like after the baby arrived. Feeding schedules, sleep deprivation, visitors, family support. Eventually, the conversation turned toward Patricia. Ryan remained quiet for a few moments. Before speaking, "I think we need boundaries." Hearing those words felt like a breakthrough. A month earlier, Ryan would have dismissed most of my concerns as grandmother enthusiasm. Now he was reaching the same conclusions on his own. "What kind of boundaries?" I asked. He sighed. "The kind that should probably have been discussed weeks ago." That evening we made a list together. We agreed that overnight visits would not happen while the baby was still an infant. We agreed that major parenting decisions would be made by us. We agreed that advice could be offered but not imposed. Most importantly, we agreed that neither of us wanted other people presenting themselves as decision-makers in our child's life. The conversation felt productive. It felt healthy. Yet part of me knew the real challenge still lay ahead. Creating boundaries on paper is easy. Enforcing them with family is something entirely different. 3 days later, Patricia called while I was organizing baby supplies. The conversation started normally. Then she casually mentioned that she had already spoken with several relatives about babysitting arrangements after the birth. I froze. "Babysitting arrangements?" "Yes," she replied cheerfully. "Everyone knows I will be helping quite a bit." My pulse quickened. "Patricia, Ryan and I have not finalized any plans yet." There was a brief pause. "Well, you will eventually." The confidence in her voice immediately stood out. It was not confidence based on a discussion. It was confidence based on expectation. After the call ended, I sat quietly and thought about something that had been bothering me for weeks. Every conversation seemed to revolve around Patricia's role, her plans, her expectations, her ideas. Very little attention was being paid to what Ryan and I actually wanted. That realization led to an even bigger one. This situation had never really been about childcare. It had never been about experience. It had never been about helping exhausted new parents. At its core, this was about control. Once I recognized that truth, everything else became easier to understand. Control often disguises itself as concern, presents itself as wisdom, calls itself support, but underneath it seeks authority. Patricia genuinely loved this baby. I never doubted that. The problem was that love does not automatically grant ownership. Love does not create entitlement. Love does not transfer parental responsibility from one person to another. Later that week, my sister stopped by with dinner. As we sat in the kitchen talking, she asked how I was feeling about everything. I told her the entire story. The baby shower announcement, the schedules, the nursery, the conversations. When I finished, she looked at me thoughtfully. Then she asked a question I had not considered before. "Has anyone ever actually told Patricia no?" I opened my mouth to answer and immediately stopped. The truth was startling. Throughout all the conversations and uncomfortable moments, very few people had directly challenged her assumptions. Most relatives laughed awkwardly. Others changed the subject. Ryan had only recently begun questioning things himself. Suddenly I understood something else. Patricia's confidence had likely grown because nobody had interrupted it. Every unchallenged assumption became another brick in the future she was building inside her mind. As my due date approached, I could feel a decision slowly forming inside me. For months I had been observing, analyzing, hoping the situation would correct itself. But babies have a way of making priorities crystal clear. Soon I would become a mother. And when that happened, avoiding conflict would matter far less than protecting healthy boundaries. For the first time since the baby shower, I stopped wondering whether Patricia would eventually understand. Instead, I started preparing for the possibility that she might need to hear the truth directly. 2 days before my due date, Ryan finally saw the situation with complete clarity. Until then, he had been moving through stages of understanding. First confusion, then concern, then recognition. But there is a difference between recognizing a problem and fully accepting what it means. That final step happened unexpectedly during a family dinner. Patricia had invited several relatives to her house for what she called a casual gathering before the baby arrived. At first, everything felt normal. Family members chatted in the living room. People asked how I was feeling. Several relatives offered encouragement and shared stories about raising children. For most of the evening, I actually enjoyed myself. Then the conversation shifted toward the upcoming birth. An aunt asked whether we had finalized our hospital plans. Before I could answer, Patricia spoke. I already have everything arranged on my end. Several people looked confused. Ryan frowned. What do you mean? Patricia smiled confidently. I cleared my schedule for several weeks. Nobody reacted immediately. Patricia continued. Someone has to make sure the baby stays on a proper routine. The familiar knot formed in my stomach. I had heard versions of this speech before. The difference was that Ryan was hearing it differently now too. One cousin laughed politely. Sounds like you are preparing for a full-time job. Patricia laughed as well. Honestly, it practically will be. Then she looked directly at me. New mothers usually have no idea how exhausting those first months can be. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. Ryan remained silent. Patricia continued speaking. Thankfully, I know exactly what needs to be done. I watched Ryan carefully. His expression had changed. There was no confusion anymore. No uncertainty. He looked disappointed. For the first time, I think he truly understood how often these comments position me as a spectator in my own motherhood. The conversation moved on, but the damage had already been done. Later that evening, while helping clean dishes in the kitchen, Ryan spoke quietly. I owe you an apology. I looked at him. For what? He set a plate into the dishwasher and sighed. For not seeing this sooner. The words caught me off guard. Ryan shook his head slightly. I kept telling myself Mom was excited. I kept trying to find harmless explanations. His voice softened. But she is not talking about helping anymore. She is talking about replacing decisions that belong to us. Hearing him say it aloud felt strangely emotional. Not because I needed validation. Because I had spent months wondering whether I was exaggerating the problem. Ryan continued. You have been dealing with this for a long time. I nodded slowly. I did not want to believe it at first either. For several moments we stood silently in the kitchen. Family conversations drifted in from the dining room. The house remained warm and cheerful. Yet something important had shifted between us. We were finally standing on the same side of the issue. That night after we returned home, Ryan surprised me again. He sat down beside me on the couch holding a notebook. I think we need a plan. I smiled faintly. A plan? He nodded. Not for the baby. For boundaries. We spent the next hour discussing specific situations that might arise after the birth. Hospital visits. Overnight guests. Babysitting expectations. Parenting decisions. The conversation felt calm and practical. Neither of us spoke with anger. We simply acknowledged reality. At one point Ryan looked directly at me. I want you to know something. What? He reached for my hand. You are this baby's mother. Nobody else. The simplicity of the statement nearly brought tears to my eyes. Not because I doubted it. Because hearing my husband say it so clearly mattered more than I realized. For months, Patricia's expectations had occupied so much space that they sometimes overshadowed what should have been obvious. Ryan continued. I love my mother. But loving her does not mean giving her authority she does not have. That sentence stayed with me. Love and boundaries could exist together. Respect and limits could coexist. The two were not opposites. As my due date approached, I noticed a new sense of calm settling over me. The situation itself had not changed. Patricia still believed many of the same things. The difference was that I was no longer facing them alone. Ryan finally saw the pattern. He finally understood the problem. Most importantly, he was prepared to address it. Looking back now, I realize that moment marked a turning point in our story. Because difficult family situations become much easier to navigate when both partners recognize the same reality. For the first time since that baby shower, I felt something I had not experienced in months. Confidence. Not confidence that Patricia would suddenly change. confidence that Ryan and I were finally ready to protect the family we were about to build. Our daughter arrived 3 days later on a quiet Thursday morning. The delivery went smoothly, and for the first time in months, every concern that had consumed my thoughts disappeared. The moment I held her, everything else seemed smaller. The schedules, the assumptions, the awkward conversations. None of it mattered as much as the tiny person sleeping peacefully in my arms. Ryan felt the same way. For 2 days we existed in a happy blur of hospital visits, newborn photographs, and exhausted smiles. Family members stopped by briefly. Friends sent messages. Nurses checked on us regularly. The atmosphere felt calm and joyful. Patricia visited on the second day. At first, the visit seemed surprisingly normal. She held the baby, smiled proudly, told everyone how beautiful her granddaughter was. For a while, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps becoming a grandmother had finally shifted her perspective. Maybe seeing the baby in person had helped her understand the difference between being a grandparent and being a parent. Unfortunately, that hope did not last very long. The problem appeared on the morning we were scheduled to leave the hospital. Ryan had stepped out to pick up paperwork while I sat beside the bassinet watching our daughter sleep. Patricia was sitting nearby in a chair. The room felt peaceful. Then she spoke. "I have already prepared everything." I looked up. "Prepared what?" She smiled. "For when she comes home." I assumed she meant gifts or supplies. That was thoughtful. Patricia nodded. "The nursery is ready. The schedule is ready. Everything is organized." Something in her tone immediately caught my attention. "The nursery at your house?" "Of course." She sounded surprised that I would even ask. Then she added the sentence that changed everything. "I was thinking she could stay with me 3 nights each week once you recover."
Ist daher.
For several seconds I genuinely thought I had misunderstood. 3 nights. Patricia nodded confidently. "That will give you time to rest while I handle the difficult parts." The room suddenly felt much smaller. I looked at my sleeping newborn. She was less than 48 hours old. Less than 48 hours old. Yet Patricia was already discussing regular overnight arrangements as though they had been approved months ago. I took a slow breath. "Patricia, that is not happening." The words came out calmly, firmly, without anger. She blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean our daughter will be living with her parents." Confusion immediately crossed her face. Then disappointment. "Sarah, you do not understand how exhausting this will become." "Actually, I do." She leaned forward. "I am trying to help." There it was again. The familiar explanation. The familiar justification. The same argument that had appeared in different forms for months. Except now something felt different. For the first time, I was no longer willing to quietly absorb it. "Patricia," I said gently, "help and control are not the same thing." Her expression changed instantly. Before she could respond, Ryan walked back into the room carrying discharge paperwork. He immediately sensed the tension. "Everything okay?" Patricia turned toward him. "Your wife thinks I am trying to control things." Ryan looked at me. Then he looked at his mother. For a brief moment nobody spoke. Finally he sat down beside me. "Mom," he said calmly, "we already talked about this." Patricia looked surprised. "Talked about what?" "Boundaries." The word seemed to catch her completely off guard. Ryan continued. "We appreciate your support. We appreciate your love. But parenting decisions belong to Sarah and me." Patricia stared at him. "I am only trying to help." Ryan nodded. "I know." His voice remained kind. "But you keep making plans without asking us." For the first time, I saw genuine confusion on Patricia's face. Not anger. Not defensiveness. Confusion. As though she had never considered the possibility that her plans might not automatically become reality. The room fell silent. Our daughter slept peacefully between us, completely unaware of the conversation unfolding around her. Looking at her tiny face, I realized something important. This moment was bigger than overnight visits, bigger than schedules, bigger than Patricia. It was about establishing the kind of family Ryan and I wanted to build. And for the first time since this entire situation began, we were finally saying it out loud. The silence inside the hospital room lasted longer than I expected. Patricia sat perfectly still, staring at Ryan as though she had just heard a language she did not understand. Our daughter remained asleep in the bassinet beside me, completely unaware that one of the most important conversations in our family was finally happening. Ryan kept his voice calm. "Mom, this is not about shutting you out." Patricia looked from him to me. "Then why does it feel that way?" For the first time since all of this began, I noticed something beneath her confidence. Hurt. Real hurt. Not the hurt of someone being rejected. The hurt of someone whose expectations had collided with reality. I took a slow breath before speaking. "Patricia, can I ask you something?" She nodded cautiously. "When did you start imagining all of this?" Her expression changed immediately. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She looked down at her hands for several seconds before answering. "Probably longer ago than I realized." Neither Ryan nor I interrupted. Patricia continued quietly. "When you announced the pregnancy, I was excited." She smiled faintly. "Then I started remembering what it was like when Ryan was little." Her eyes softened. "Some of the happiest years of my life. For the first time, I was not hearing plans or instructions. I was hearing honesty." "I think I got carried away," she admitted. Ryan nodded gently. "Mom, there is nothing wrong with being excited." Patricia sighed. "I know." Then she looked at me. "But maybe I started imagining a role that was not actually mine." The room became quiet again. This silence felt different from the others. Less defensive. More reflective. I reached over and adjusted the blanket covering my daughter. Then I looked back at Patricia. "Nobody is saying you cannot be an important part of her life." Her eyes immediately lifted toward mine. "We want that." Ryan nodded. "Absolutely." Patricia swallowed hard. Then, "Why does this feel so painful?" The answer came to me almost instantly. "Because you are grieving an expectation." The words surprised even me. Patricia stared at me for several moments. Then something remarkable happened. She nodded slowly, as though a puzzle piece had finally fallen into place. "Maybe you are right." She looked toward the bassinet. I kept picturing things a certain way. Her voice grew softer. And I never stopped to ask whether those pictures matched reality. Ryan reached forward and gently placed a hand on his mother's shoulder. "You are her grandmother." Patricia smiled sadly. "I know. And that is a wonderful thing." For the first time since entering the room, Patricia's expression relaxed slightly. "I suppose I forgot that being a grandmother is already enough." The honesty in her voice touched me more than I expected. Because throughout this entire situation, I had often viewed Patricia as an obstacle, problem to solve, a conflict to manage. Sitting there now, I saw something else. A woman struggling to let go of a chapter of life she deeply missed. That realization did not excuse her behavior, but it helped me understand it. A few hours later, after we arrived home with the baby, several family members stopped by briefly to meet the newest member of the family. Word had already spread about the hospital conversation. Not because anyone had been gossiping, because family dynamics rarely remain hidden for long. At one point, an aunt jokingly asked Patricia whether she was ready to start raising another child. The room became noticeably quiet. Everyone looked toward her. For a moment, I wondered how she would respond. Patricia surprised all of us. She smiled and shook her head. "No." Then she glanced toward me. "That job belongs to her mother." The room immediately relaxed. Several relatives smiled. One cousin laughed softly. The tension that had existed for months seemed to loosen all at once. I looked at Patricia. She returned the look with a small nod. No speech. No dramatiche palegi. Just acknowledgement. Sometimes that is enough. Later that night, after visitors left and the house finally became quiet, I sat in the nursery holding my sleeping daughter. Ryan sat beside me. Neither of us spoke for a while. Eventually he smiled. "Today went better than I expected." I laughed softly. "Much better." Looking down at my daughter, I realized something important. Boundaries are often misunderstood. People assume they are walls meant to keep others out. The healthiest boundaries are not walls. They are definitions. They clarify roles. They protect relationships. They allow people to love one another without confusion about where one person's responsibilities end and another's begin. For months, Patricia had been trying to step into a role that was never hers. Today, for the first time, she seemed willing to let that role go. And as I rocked my daughter gently beneath the soft nursery light, I found myself believing that our family might finally have a chance to move forward together. 6 months later, I found myself standing in Patricia's kitchen watching my daughter laugh from a high chair, while mashed sweet potatoes somehow covered more of the tray than she had actually eaten. The sight made me smile. Not because everything had become perfect. Families rarely work that way. I smiled because we had arrived at a place that once seemed impossible. A place built on understanding rather than assumptions. A place built on respect rather than control. The first few months after the birth had not been easy. New parenthood rarely is. There were sleepless nights. Endless diaper changes. Moments of uncertainty. Moments of exhaustion. Yet through it all, something important remained intact. Ryan and I were allowed to become parents in our own way. Patricia still visited often. She still loved spending time with her granddaughter. But the dynamic had changed. Instead of arriving with instructions, she arrived with questions. Instead of assuming, she asked. Instead of directing, she supported. The difference transformed everything. One afternoon, about 3 months after the birth, Patricia surprised me with a conversation I never expected to have. We were sitting together in my living room while the baby slept upstairs. The house was unusually quiet. Patricia looked thoughtful for several minutes before finally speaking. "I owe you another apology." I looked at her with surprise. "You already apologized." She nodded. "I know." Then she smiled sadly. "But I do not think I fully understood what I was apologizing for at the time." I remained silent and listened. Patricia folded her hands together. When Ryan was growing up, being his mother became the center of my world. Her eyes softened. Then he became an adult. He built his own life. Started his own family. She looked down briefly. I think part of me struggled more with that transition than I wanted to admit. The honesty in her voice was impossible to miss. "When I found out you were pregnant, I convinced myself I was preparing to help." She laughed softly. "The truth is that I was preparing to feel needed again." Her words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Not because they excused the past, because they explained it. Sometimes understanding arrives long after conflict begins. Looking back, I realized Patricia had never been trying to take my daughter away from me. She had been trying to hold on to a version of herself that no longer existed. Unfortunately, she had nearly crossed important boundaries while doing it. The months that followed continued to improve. Family gatherings felt lighter. Conversations felt more natural. Relatives who had once looked uncomfortable around Patricia's comments now seemed relaxed. Most importantly, my daughter developed a wonderful relationship with her grandmother. A healthy relationship. A balanced relationship. Patricia got to be exactly what she was meant to be. Not a replacement parent. Not a decision maker. A grandmother. And it turned out that role suited her perfectly. One evening shortly before my daughter's first Thanksgiving, our family gathered at Ryan's aunt's house. The dining room overflowed with food, laughter, and stories. At one point, someone jokingly asked Patricia whether she planned to raise any more grandchildren. The entire table laughed. Patricia laughed too. Then she pointed toward me. "Absolutely not." More laughter followed. She smiled warmly. "That little girl already has an excellent mother." The words were simple, yet they meant more than anyone at the table probably realized. I caught Ryan looking at me from across the room. He smiled. I smiled back. No further explanation was necessary. Later that night, after everyone went home, I sat quietly in the nursery watching my daughter sleep. The room looked different now. Not because the furniture had changed, because I had changed. Months earlier, I spent countless hours worrying about what Patricia might do, what she might say, how much influence she might try to claim. Now those fears felt distant. Not because conflict had magically disappeared. Because healthy boundaries had replaced uncertainty. Looking at my daughter, I thought about everything this experience had taught me. Boundaries are not punishments. They are acts of clarity. Speaking honestly is not cruelty. It is respect. And protecting your role in your own family is not selfish. It is necessary. My daughter stirred slightly in her sleep before settling again beneath her blanket. I smiled and quietly turned off the nursery light. As I walked toward the door, one final thought crossed my mind. The day Patricia announced she would raise my baby felt like the beginning of a battle. In reality, it became the beginning of a conversation our family desperately needed. And because that conversation finally happened, a grandmother found her proper place, a husband found his voice, and a mother learned to trust her own. In the end, that was the future worth building.